A retired Navy SEAL kept one empty water bowl in his kitchen for years. It belonged to Atlas, the German shepherd he was told never made it home. Then, on a bright, snowy morning, Caleb stopped near a rescue shelter and heard panic inside a transport van. One wounded dog broke free from a cage, thin, scarred, and wearing the wrong name. But when Caleb whispered the old name, the dog remembered. Atlas had come back from the dead, not to be rescued alone,
boy, I'm here.
but to make Caleb see every other dog still trapped behind those doors. Stay until the end, then tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. Winter came to Harbor Fall, Maine, as if the sky had decided to forgive the town in white. Snow lay over the docks, over the roofs of the fish houses, over the narrow roads that curved between pine trees and old clapboard homes. In the mornings, the harbor looked almost holy. Boats sat locked in ice, their ropes stiff with frost, their hulls creaking softly whenever the tide shifted beneath the frozen skin of the water. Smoke rose from chimneys in pale blue threads. Gulls cried over the bay with the same rude confidence they had in July, as if no season had the right to silence them. Caleb Whitaker liked that about gulls. They were ugly little kings with wings. He stood outside his boat repair shed before sunrise, a mug of black coffee warming his scarred hands, and watched one of them land on the roof of a lobster boat like it owned the entire Atlantic. The bird screamed once, at nothing in particular. "Morning to you too," Caleb muttered. His voice was low, roughened by cold air and long silences. At 51, Caleb still had the build of a man who had once carried other men through smoke, water, and ruin. He stood a little over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, lean through the waist, his strength not showy but settled deep in him like oak roots under frozen ground. Time had carved quiet lines around his blue-gray eyes. His nose had a slight bend from an old break. His brown hair had faded toward ash at the temples, kept short at the sides, longer on top, usually disturbed by wind. A short salt and pepper beard shadowed his jaw, trimmed enough to show discipline, uneven enough to show he no longer cared what anyone in uniform thought of him. He wore his old olive-drab combat shirt beneath a heavy canvas jacket, the camouflage sleeves faded at the elbows, the dark bands around the upper arms softened by years of washing. He had other clothes. Warmer clothes, newer clothes, clothes without ghosts stitched into the seams. He wore this one anyway. The repair shed sat at the edge of the harbor between a bait shop and a storage yard full of crab traps. A crooked sign above the door read Whitaker Marine Repair, painted by a local artist who had charged him half price because Caleb had once fixed her father's skiff for free. Most days, Caleb repaired outboard motors, patched hulls, replaced rotted planks, and listened to fishermen complain about whether they would go out in anyway. It was honest work, loud enough to keep his hands busy, simple enough that machines made more sense than people. A broken engine did not ask where he had served, a cracked rudder did not call him a hero. A rusted hinge did not lower its voice and say, "I heard what happened over there." By 7, the town began to wake. Tires hissed through slush. The bakery across the road lit its windows. A mail truck coughed its way down the hill. Caleb opened the shed, turned on the heater, and checked the day's work orders clipped to a nail by the door. 3 boats, 1 generator, a cracked fuel line, manageable. He liked manageable things. On the workbench, beside a tray of bolts, lay a small metal dog whistle on a worn leather cord. The engraving had nearly faded, but Caleb knew every scratch by memory. A.W. 42, Atlas Whitaker, Unit 42. He did not touch it at first. He simply looked at it, the way a man might look at a closed door in a house where someone had died. Then he picked it up, rubbed his thumb across the engraving, and slipped it beneath his shirt. The metal was cold against his chest. It always was. Years earlier, before Harbor Fall had become his quiet kingdom of snow and engines, Caleb had lived in another world, sand instead of ice, heat instead of salt wind. Hours measured not by tide charts, but by patrol routes, radio calls, and the weight of silence before an explosion. Atlas had moved through that world beside him. A male German shepherd with a black and gold coat, sharp ears, and eyes that missed nothing. He was not the biggest canine in the unit, nor the loudest, but he had a steadiness that made men trust him before they trusted themselves. Atlas could read a road better than some men read a map. He could freeze mid-step when danger hid beneath dust. He could turn his head toward Caleb with a look that seemed to say, "You are about to do something stupid, and I would prefer not to die because of it." Caleb had once told him, during a long night under a sky crowded with foreign stars, "You're bossier than my first chief." Atlas had sneezed in his face. That had been the closest thing to agreement. They had been together for nearly 4 years, long enough for Caleb to know the rhythm of Atlas's breathing when he slept, long enough for Atlas to know that Caleb's left knee ached before rain, long enough that when other men said, "my dog," Caleb heard something too small in the phrase. Atlas had been his partner, his witness, his last piece of faith in a world that had asked too much and returned too little. The final mission came back to Caleb in pieces, never as a whole. Memory, merciful and cruel, had shattered it like glass. A mountain road. Radio static. Atlas pulling hard against the lead, then stopping. Caleb's hand rising. A shout. Light. Then a force that lifted the earth and tore the sky open. He remembered Atlas launching forward, not away from danger, but toward Caleb, as if his whole body had become a commandment. Live. Then nothing. When Caleb woke, it was to white sheets, fluorescent lights, and pain so large it seemed to have weather systems of its own. His throat was dry. His ears rang. His right side felt packed with fire. A nurse leaned over him, saying his name. Someone told him he was in Germany. Someone said surgery. Someone said lucky. Caleb had grabbed the wrist nearest him. "Atlas!" he rasped. The room had changed then. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the air had shifted. Men who had faced gunfire looked away from him. A teammate finally sat beside the bed. His face was bruised, one eye swollen. His voice came out flat, like he had hammered the feeling out of it before entering the room. "They couldn't retrieve him, Caleb." "That was not an answer," Caleb asked again. The man swallowed. Blast zone was unstable, secondary fire, no movement seen after. Command marked him presumed lost. Presumed lost. It was a phrase built to sound official because it could not bear to sound human. Caleb had closed his eyes, not because he accepted it, but because the pain in his body was suddenly easier than the hole opening inside his chest. When he finally came home to Maine, people expected him to be grateful. He was alive. He could walk, though some mornings his leg argued the point. He had both hands, though one trembled when he was tired. He had benefits, medals he kept in a drawer, and a town that called him brave in the gentle, distant way people used when they did not know what bravery had cost. But Atlas had no grave, no folded flag, no final touch behind the ears, no last command releasing him from duty. For the first year, Caleb fought the silence. He made calls from the kitchen table until his voice went hoarse. He filled out forms. He wrote emails to offices that answered with polished sympathy and no useful information. He contacted veterans groups, military K-9 networks, anyone who might know how to trace a dog lost in a war zone. Nothing. No new records, no transport logs. No witness who could say Atlas had been seen alive. Hope became a cruel little animal in Caleb's ribs. Every time it stirred, something official stepped on it. Eventually, he stopped asking. Not because he stopped loving Atlas, because a man can only keep knocking on a sealed door for so long before his own knuckles become the thing that breaks. So Caleb began doing the next closest thing to penance. He helped dogs, not in a grand way. Grand gestures made him uncomfortable. He did not give speeches or pose for charity calendars, though Marin Holt once threatened to put him in one holding 3 beagles and wearing a Santa hat. "I'd rather eat fiberglass," he had told her. "Don't tempt me," Marin had replied. The beagles would carry the photo. Marin ran Harborfall Canine Haven, a rescue shelter tucked at the edge of the pine woods north of town. She was 48, compact and sturdy, with short brown hair that never obeyed her. Red wool gloves she wore until they had holes, and the weary authority of a woman who had cleaned up every kind of mess humans could make for animals. Her voice was dry as kindling, but Caleb had once seen her cry because an old hound with cloudy eyes finally wagged his tail after 2 weeks of refusing to stand. Marin never asked Caleb too many questions. That was one reason he kept going back. He fixed broken kennel doors, rebuilt an outdoor run after a storm dropped a pine across the fence, hauled bags of food from his truck, paid vet bills anonymously until Marin told him anonymous donations were less anonymous when they arrived in envelopes smelling like boat grease. "You're bad at being mysterious," she said. "I'll work on that." "You won't." She was right. Once a month, sometimes more, Caleb drove out to the shelter with supplies, blankets, food, cleaning solution. Chew toys strong enough to survive dogs with more jaw than manners. He told himself it was useful, practical, a way to help creatures who had been failed by people and still somehow looked at people with hope. But Marin knew. Maybe she had known from the first day he arrived, carrying 2 bags of senior dog food and staring too long at an empty kennel. For Caleb, every dog he helped was not Atlas. And also, somehow, Atlas. That evening, after closing the repair shed, Caleb returned to his small house above the harbor. It stood at the end of a narrow lane, cedar-sided, weathered silver by salt and wind. Snow gathered along the porch rail. A single lamp glowed in the kitchen window. Inside, the house was warm and spare. Work boots by the door, a stack of books near the couch, a framed photograph turned face down on a shelf because some days memory needed manners. Caleb hung his jacket, washed his hands, and filled the kettle. Then, as he did every night, without admitting it was a ritual, he looked toward the corner beside the kitchen cabinet. The bowl was still there, stainless steel, dented along one side, clean. Atlas's water bowl. Caleb had tried to move it once, not throw it away. He could never have done that. Just move it to the closet, where old things could rest without staring back. He had picked it up on a rainy afternoon 2 years after coming home. A single pale dog hair had clung to the rim. Caleb had stood there for a long time, bowl in hand, feeling foolish and gutted and angry at a piece of kitchenware for having the power to ruin him. Then he had put it back. Since then, he kept it washed, empty but clean, a small lighthouse for a soul with no harbor. The kettle began to whistle. Caleb turned off the stove. Outside, snow drifted past the window, soft as ash, bright as forgiveness. Somewhere down by the docks, a gull screamed again into the dark. Caleb almost smiled. "Still king of the Atlantic," he said. The house answered with its usual quiet. He poured his tea, stood for another moment beside the bowl, and touched the whistle beneath his shirt. Tomorrow he would drive to Harborfall, Canine Haven. Marin had called that morning about a delivery coming in. More dogs than expected, more mouths to feed, more kennels to repair before the next freeze. Caleb had said yes before she finished asking. He always did. He turned out the kitchen light and left the bowl where it had waited for years. Empty, clean, ready. The next morning arrived bright enough to hurt. Snow had fallen through the night, not in a storm, but in that steady, patient way Maine had of burying the world without raising its voice. By sunrise, Harborfall looked newly made. Every roof wore a white crown, every pine branch bent under silver weight. The road outside Caleb Whitaker's house had been plowed once, badly, leaving ridges of snow like frozen waves along the shoulder. Caleb loaded the truck before 8. Blankets first. Then 3 bags of dog food, 2 boxes of medical pads, a crate of disinfectant, and a bundle of old towels tied with twine. The towels had come from the motel near the harbor. Marin had once said dogs did not care if a towel had a faded anchor pattern, only whether it was dry and warm. He wore his olive combat shirt under a dark green parka, camouflage sleeves visible when he reached for the last box. The little metal whistle rested beneath the layers, cold against his chest as always. He did not think of it as a promise that morning, only as weight. Some days, grief became part of the clothing. The drive north toward Harborfall Canine Haven took him along the edge of the bay before the road curved inland. Sunlight struck the snowfield so sharply that the land seemed covered in broken glass. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift. The heater rattled. In the bed of the truck, the supplies shifted softly whenever he turned. He was thinking about a kennel latch Marin had asked him to repair, and about whether the Old South Run would need another beam before February when he heard it. At first it was only a smear of sound under the engine. Then the road dipped, the trees opened, and the noise sharpened. Dogs. Not barking the way shelter dogs barked when they smelled food or heard a familiar truck. This was rougher, higher, ragged around the edges. Claws scraped metal. Something slammed hard against a cage wall. A chorus of panic rose and fell, as if each animal was frightening the next. Caleb slowed. Harborfall Canine Haven sat beyond a split-rail fence at the end of the lane, its main building painted weathered blue, smoke lifting from the chimney. But before the gate, angled half into the plowed shoulder, stood an old white transport van with rust along the bottom panels. Black lettering on the side read Northern Mercy Transport. Beneath it, in smaller words, was a slogan Caleb disliked on sight: Moving Hope Home. The rear doors were open. Inside, stacked in 2 rows, were wire travel crates and plastic kennels strapped with fraying tie-downs. A few were covered with blankets. Others were not. Steam rose from the dog's breath and vanished into the cold. 2 men stood near the back of the van. One was broad, red-faced, and zipped into a black puffer jacket, too clean for the work he was doing. The other was thinner, with a knit cap pulled low and a clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. Both turned when Caleb's truck rolled to a stop. The broad one lifted a hand, not in greeting, but in warning. "Shelter's receiving," he called. "You'll need to park clear." Caleb got out slowly. He had learned long ago that speed made nervous men worse. So did silence. Sometimes, but he trusted silence more. "I'm not blocking you," he said. "You at the shelter?" "Volunteer." The thinner man looked him over. His eyes caught on Caleb's sleeves, the shape of him, the boots. "Then maybe go inside and get Marin. We're already behind." A metal crash came from the van. Caleb's gaze shifted past them. One of the crates near the rear rocked hard, its wire door bending outward with each impact. A low, hoarse growl came from inside, but there was no aggression in it that Caleb could hear. There was terror, pain, a desperate animal throwing its body against a wall because the wall was smaller than the fear behind it. The broad man cursed under his breath and grabbed for the crate. "Bruno, quit it!" The name hit the air flat. The dog inside hit the door again. This time, the latch gave. The wire door sprang open, and a German shepherd burst from the crate like a shadow kicked loose from a nightmare. He landed badly in the snow, hind legs slipping, ribs showing through a filthy black and gold coat. His body was too thin for his frame, all hard angles beneath matted fur. Scars broke the pattern of his coat in pale lines. One ear stood high, the other had a torn tip. His left hind leg trembled as he scrambled away from the van. The broad man lunged for him. Caleb moved first. "Don't!" It was not loud. It was enough. The man stopped halfway, one hand still extended. The shepherd spun, teeth visible, but he did not charge. His breath came in harsh bursts. His eyes moved from the men to the open lane, then to the shelter fence, then to Caleb. Snow clung to his whiskers. His tail was low, stiff, not tucked but ready. A dog who had learned that survival lived in the half-second before a hand closed. "Sir," the thin man said, trying for authority and missing, "that animal is reactive. Step back." Caleb did not step forward. He lowered his shoulders slightly, turned his body at an angle, let his hands hang open. No sudden reach, no direct stare held too long. The shepherd's eyes flicked over him. Caleb felt something inside his chest shift so sharply he almost missed his next breath. No, the word did not come out. It could not be. There were thousands of German shepherds in the world. Black and gold coats, sharp ears, watchful eyes. War had not left one ghost alive, just to place him on a snowy road in Maine. But the dog's left hind foot set down strangely, toe first, then heel. A small correction, a habit born from an old injury. Caleb knew that correction. His hand moved, almost without permission, toward his own left knee. The shepherd's head tilted. Not much, barely a movement. But there it was, that old angle of listening, as if the world had spoken in a frequency only he found worth considering. The cold became strangely far away. Caleb saw the shoulder then. Beneath dirt and broken fur, just above the left foreleg, a crescent-shaped scar curved pale against dark hair. Years earlier, Caleb had cleaned that wound with canteen water and half a bandage while Atlas had sat stone still, offended more by the fuss than the pain. The whistle under Caleb's shirt felt suddenly heavy enough to drag him to his knees. The broad man took another step. The shepherd flinched, and Caleb's voice came out before thought could catch it. Easy. Downwind. The words were soft, almost foolish in the open cold. They were not a command anyone else would know. Not formal. Not in a manual. Caleb had made it up after Atlas learned to tense whenever dust blew across patrol routes. It meant, stop fighting the air. Breathe. Find me. The shepherd froze. The two transport men stared. Caleb could hear the dogs in the van, the heater of his truck ticking behind him, a gull crying somewhere far off like an idiot prophet. He could hear his own heart, not pounding now, but striking slow and deep. He swallowed. Atlas. The dog turned his head fully. For a moment, nothing in the world moved except falling snow. The shepherd's face changed first in the smallest way. The tightness around the eyes loosened. His ears shifted forward. His mouth closed. He stared at Caleb as if looking through ruin, through winters, through cages and wrong names, and hands that had not been kind, trying to reach the man beneath time. Then he made a sound. Not a bark. Not a growl. A broken, rising whine. Caleb's knees weakened. The shepherd came toward him, not smoothly, not like the powerful dog Caleb remembered cutting across desert rock, but with a lurching urgency that tore through every defense Caleb had spent years building. He crossed the snow in 3 uneven strides and struck Caleb's legs hard enough to make him stagger. Then the dog pressed his forehead into Caleb's left knee. Exactly there, exactly as before, Caleb went down into the snow. He did not care about the cold soaking through his jeans. He did not care that the transport men were watching, that the shelter door had opened, that someone shouted his name from across the yard. He put both hands around the dog's neck, felt bone where there should have been muscle, felt dirt, scars, trembling heat. Atlas, he whispered. The dog pushed harder against him, ribs heaving. Paws braced on either side of Caleb's boots, as if the earth might try to separate them again. His body shook. Caleb bent over him, one hand spreading across the old crescent scar, the other buried in the rough at his neck. He had imagined this moment in dreams and hated himself for it afterward. In dreams, Atlas had come back whole, proud, young, untouched by everything Caleb had failed to prevent. But the dog in his arms was not a dream. He smelled of metal, fear, old wounds, and frozen road. His coat was patchy. His breath was sour. His collar was cheap nylon, too tight, with a plastic tag that read Bruno in black marker. Caleb took the tag in 2 fingers. Something hot and ancient moved behind his ribs. Not rage yet. Rage would have been easier. This was worse. This was grief finding flesh. "Who put that on you?" he said. Atlas only trembled. From the shelter yard, Marin Holt came fast through the snow in red gloves and unlaced boots, her coat half-zipped as if she had run out before finishing the thought. 2 shelter workers followed her, both wide-eyed, one carrying a leash he clearly had no idea whether to use. "Caleb?" Marin called. "What happened?" The broad transport man recovered himself first. "Your volunteer interfered with a reactive dog. We need him contained." Marin stopped a few feet away. Her sharp eyes moved from the open crate to the dog in Caleb's arms, then to Caleb's face. Whatever she had planned to say died there. Caleb looked up at her. For years, Marin had seen him tired, stubborn, grim, occasionally amused against his will. She had seen him angry once, when someone dumped a pregnant hound outside the shelter gate in a sleet storm. But she had never seen him like this, hollowed out, lit from the wound. "Marin," he said, and his voice did not sound like his own. "This is Atlas." The shelter worker with the leash shifted. "I thought Atlas was—" He was. No one corrected the impossible grammar. The thin transport man flipped through his clipboard too quickly. "That dog is listed as Bruno. Male. Estimated 7. Transfer from County Overflow in New Hampshire. We have papers." Caleb rose slowly, one hand still on Atlas's neck. The dog rose with him, pressed against his leg. "Say that name again," Caleb said. The man blinked. "Bruno?" Atlas did not move. Caleb looked down at him, then back at the man. "Atlas." The shepherd leaned into him so hard, Caleb had to brace his stance. Marin's mouth tightened. The broad man scoffed. "Dogs respond to tone." "Doesn't prove anything." "No," Marin said quietly. "But starving a dog in a crate doesn't prove much for your paperwork either." The man flushed. "Careful." "Oh, honey," Marin said, voice dry enough to sand wood. "I was born careful. Then I started running a shelter." A faint, absurd laugh almost escaped Caleb. Almost. Another crash sounded from the van. Atlas jerked away from Caleb's leg. For the first time since the reunion, the dog looked somewhere else. His head snapped toward the rear doors. His body went rigid, not with fear for himself, but with a terrible attention. Inside the van, a gray muzzled hound pawed weakly at a kennel door. A smaller dog whimpered under a blanket. Somewhere deeper in the stack, claws scratched in frantic rhythm against plastic. Atlas took one step toward them. Caleb tightened his hand gently around the loose skin at the dog's neck, not to stop him, to let him know he was there. Atlas looked back at Caleb. There was no language for what passed between them then. No command, no miracle, no old military signal. Just a wounded dog, ribs showing beneath dirty fur, asking with his whole body for something he could not say. "Not me, alone." Caleb felt the snow falling on his shoulders. For years, he had carried one regret like a stone. He had not gone back. Now the road had put the choice before him again. Smaller than a battlefield, quieter than an explosion, but no less absolute. He looked at the van of cages, then at Marin. "These dogs aren't leaving like this," he said. The thin man snapped the clipboard shut. "You don't have authority to hold a transport." "No," Caleb said. His voice settled back into its old calm, the dangerous kind that did not need volume. "But she does run the place you're trying to deliver to, and those dogs look like hell." Marin's eyes remained on Atlas for one more second. Something in her face softened and hardened at the same time. Then she turned toward the shelter building. "I'm calling the county," she said. "And Willa." The broad man cursed. The thin one started arguing about schedules, contracts, intake windows, liabilities. Marin ignored him with the holy concentration of a woman who had ignored better men for better reasons. Atlas stayed beside Caleb, but his gaze remained fixed on the van. Caleb knelt again, slowly this time, facing him. He did not hug him. Not now. Not while Atlas was holding himself together for the others. "You came back," Caleb said under his breath. Atlas's torn ear twitched. Caleb looked at the crates, at the frightened eyes behind wire, at the breath fogging in the cold. Then he added, so softly only the dog could hear, "And you brought a war with you." Atlas leaned his head once against Caleb's hand, then turned back toward the van. Behind them, Harbor Fall Canine Haven stood bright against the snow, smoke rising from its chimney like a promise not yet tested. Caleb understood two things with a clarity that made the morning seem sharper than sunlight. Atlas was alive, and he had not escaped just to be saved. He had escaped to make Caleb see who was still trapped. Marin did not shout. That was the first thing Caleb noticed after the world began moving again. The transport men were arguing. The dogs were crying from the back of the van. One of the shelter workers was trying to hold a leash, a clipboard, and his own nerves all at once. Atlas stood pressed against Caleb's leg, trembling so hard Caleb could feel it through his pants. And Marin did not shout. She pulled on her red wool gloves properly, one finger at a time, as if preparing for surgery instead of a fight in the snow. "Paperwork," she said. The thinner transport man blinked at her. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Transfer forms, vet certificates, intake records, route sheet. All of it." The broad man in the puffer jacket folded his arms. "We're already late." Marin looked at him the way a tired schoolteacher might look at a child who had eaten paste and then denied it with paste on his chin. "That's tragic," she said. "Paperwork." Caleb almost smiled. Almost. But Atlas shifted beside him, and the sound of the dog's nails scraping lightly on frozen gravel brought Caleb back to the raw present. He kept one hand low against Atlas's neck, not holding him down, just holding him in the world. The thin man handed Marin a folder with the stiffness of someone surrendering a weapon. She opened it on the hood of Caleb's truck. The papers fluttered in the wind. Marin pinned them with her palm and began reading. Her face did not change at first, but Caleb had known her long enough to see the small signs, the tightening around her mouth, the faint lift of one eyebrow. The stillness that meant anger was being placed carefully on a shelf for later use. "This one says the hound is 3, she said. "He's estimated," the thin man replied. Marin glanced toward the van. A gray-muzzled hound stared out from a crate with clouded eyes and a face older than some churches. "If that dog is 3, I'm the Queen of Norway." The broad man exhaled loudly. "Look, lady." "Don't call me lady like it's a leash," Marin said, still reading. A shelter worker made a choking sound that might have been fear or laughter. Marin flipped another page. "This certificate expired 6 weeks ago. We were told it was updated." "By who?" The thin man tapped his clipboard. "Dispatch." "Dispatch have a last name?" No answer. Caleb watched without speaking. If he spoke too soon, he knew exactly what would come out of him, and it would not help the dogs. There were 12 animals in the van, maybe 13. The sound made counting difficult. Some barked. Some only shifted in their crates. The worst sound was the quiet from the ones too tired to complain. Atlas did not look at the transport men. He kept staring toward the van with the terrible concentration of a soldier who had heard a wounded man breathe somewhere in the dark. Marin closed the folder. "I'm calling the county." The broad man stepped closer. "You don't have authority to hold a licensed transport." "No," Marin said. "I have authority to refuse intake when paperwork doesn't match the animals, and I have authority to report suspected welfare violations on my property." "We're not on your property." Marin looked down at the snow beneath his boots. "You're blocking my gate. I'm feeling spiritually included." Caleb's radio-silent mouth betrayed him with one breath of humor. It came and went fast, but Atlas heard it. The shepherd's torn ear twitched. For one impossible second, the old world brushed the new one. Caleb remembered a desert night. Atlas sneezing into his face after a whispered joke. Then another dog whimpered from the van, and the memory folded itself away. Marin took out her phone. The transport men began arguing in low, urgent voices. Caleb did not try to listen. His attention had dropped to Atlas. The shepherd was thinner than Caleb had first understood. Under the dirty coat, the old frame remained broad chest, large head, strong bones, but the flesh had been carved down. The black saddle marking on his back was broken by pale scars. Around his neck, the fur grew unevenly beneath the cheap nylon collar. One of his paws lifted and set down again, lifted and set down, as if the snow itself hurt. "Easy," Caleb murmured. Atlas leaned harder into him. Marin ended the call and came back with a look that had weather in it. "Deputies on the way," she said. "Willa, too." The thin man went pale. "You called a vet?" "I run a shelter," Marin said. "Sometimes we like knowing whether the animals delivered to us are alive, sick, terrified, or all three. It's a little tradition we have." Caleb looked at the van again. A crate near the bottom row shook softly. Inside, a small mixed-breed dog pressed itself flat, eyes wide. Above it, the old hound stood with his head low. In the back corner, partly hidden beneath a torn blanket, a gray-coated collie stared out with cloudy eyes. Atlas saw the collie. His body changed. Not dramatically, not in a way the transport men would notice, but Caleb felt the tremor shift into purpose. Atlas took one uneven step forward. Caleb's hand followed him. "Not yet," he whispered. Atlas stopped, but he did not look away from the collie. Deputy Lena Corbett arrived in a county SUV 15 minutes later, tires crunching through the plowed lane. She was not tall, but she seemed to bring straight lines with her into the snowy disorder. Dark hair was tied low beneath a black winter cap, and her brown deputy's coat was zipped to her throat. A body camera sat clipped to her chest. In one hand she carried a navy clipboard with a metal clip worn silver at the edges. She took in the scene without wasting a word. Van, dogs, men, Marin, Caleb, German Shepherd. Her eyes paused briefly on Caleb's old combat shirt sleeve visible beneath his parka, but she did not ask about it. That alone made Caleb like her more than most people. "Marin," Lena said. "Deputy, who's in charge of transport?" The thin man lifted his clipboard as if it might salute for him. "I am the route supervisor." "Name?" "Eric Mallon." The broad man muttered, "This is ridiculous." Lena turned to him. "And you are?" "Dale." "Dale what?" A pause. "Dale Mercer." Lena wrote both names down. "Good. Now nobody is ridiculous until I say so." Marin's mouth twitched. Lena began with the van. She checked the rear doors, the crate straps, the floor, the water containers. Her movements were efficient, not theatrical. She asked questions while she worked, and when answers wandered, she brought them back by repeating the question in exactly the same tone. "How long since the dogs were last unloaded?" "We stopped outside Portland." "How long?" "Maybe 2 hours." "Maybe?" 3. Lena wrote it down. She tapped a water bowl clipped inside one crate. Ice cracked under her gloved finger. She looked at Eric. "This water is frozen." "It's cold out," Dale said. Lena glanced at him. "That observation may be useful if we begin investigating winter." A shelter worker coughed into his sleeve. Caleb kept his gaze down. Not because it was funny, though it was. In the bleak way a match is funny in a snowstorm, but because Atlas had begun shaking again when Lena touched the crate doors. Not at Lena herself, at the metal sound. The scrape of latch against wire. Caleb knelt beside him. "Breathe," he said softly. Atlas's eyes flicked to his. "Find me." The shepherd exhaled through his nose and pressed his shoulder into Caleb's chest. Lena saw it. She did not comment. But Caleb noticed the way her expression shifted, just slightly, from procedure to concern. By the time Dr. Willa Sloane's old station wagon pulled in, Lena had already documented enough to change the morning's course. Willa stepped out wearing a long gray-blue coat and carrying a black medical bag that looked older than some of the roads in town. She was a small woman, silver hair twisted into a low knot, glasses fogging immediately in the cold. She wiped them once with a cloth from her pocket, took in the scene, and sighed with the controlled disappointment of a doctor who had seen too many preventable things become emergencies. "Who first?" she asked. Marin pointed to Atlas. Willa approached slowly. not looking directly into the dog's eyes. "Hello, handsome disaster." Atlas gave a low rumble. "Fair," Willa said. "I've been called worse by cats." Caleb held still. "He's not usually—" "I know." Willa crouched at an angle a few feet away. "Fear has a vocabulary. He's speaking it fluently." The words landed somewhere in Caleb's chest. Willa did not reach for Atlas. She offered the back of her hand low, waited, then let the shepherd decide. Atlas sniffed once. His nostrils flared. He did not relax, but he did not retreat. "That's enough for a beginning," Willa said. They moved him into the shelter's intake room, a small heated space off the main building with rubber mats, cabinets of supplies, and a steel exam table Willa did not use. She examined Atlas on the floor because the table made him stiffen. Caleb sat with his back against the wall, one knee raised, Atlas half against him. Marin stood by the counter, arms folded. Lena stayed near the doorway, documenting quietly. Willa worked in silence at first. She checked Atlas's gums, his paws, his eyes, his ribs. She used her fingers more than instruments, reading the body the way some people read scripture. "Dehydrated," she said at last. "Underweight. Old muscle loss. Nails split. Pads cracked." She parted the fur around his neck and went still. Caleb's jaw tightened. The hair there grew wrong, uneven, broken by a pale ring of scar tissue. "Long-term collar pressure," Willa said. "Or restraint." Marin looked away. Willa continued down Atlas's side. "Cold burns here. Skin infection starting here. Old lacerations. Healed badly. This shoulder scar is older than the rest." Caleb placed his hand near the crescent mark, but did not touch it. "That one was from before," he said. "With me." Willa looked at him over her glasses. "No pity. Just acknowledgement. Then the others are after." The room seemed to shrink. Lena's pen stopped for half a second, then began moving again. Willa found the microchip with a scanner. The device beeped, and Lena copied the number. Marin checked it against the transport record. "Doesn't match," Marin said. Eric Mallon, standing outside the intake room under supervision of a shelter worker, called through the doorway. "Could be a clerical error." Marin turned her head slowly. "If I had $1 for every clerical error that smelled like a crime, I could build a heated pool for beagles." Willa ignored them. She had found a patch of scarred skin beneath Atlas's left side, partly hidden by matted fur. "I need to shave this area to treat it," she said to Caleb. "He may not like the sound." Caleb nodded, though every protective part of him wanted to refuse anything that might frighten the dog again. He lowered his face near Atlas's ear. "I'm here." The clippers buzzed. Atlas flinched so violently that Caleb felt the jerk in his own spine. For 1 second the dog's eyes went elsewhere, far from the heated room, far from Maine. Caleb tightened nothing. He did not restrain him more than necessary. He simply placed his palm against Atlas's chest, feeling the frantic hammer of his heart. "Find me," Caleb whispered. "That's it. Find me." Atlas's breathing hitched, then slowed. Willa shaved only what she needed. Beneath the fur and scar tissue, something dark and broken appeared in the skin. Not a wound, not dirt, a line, then another. Willa leaned closer. Lena stepped forward. Caleb stopped breathing. The marking was faint, distorted by years and damage, but part of it remained legible. 42. Willa wiped gently with antiseptic. More appeared. Not enough for a civilian registry. Not enough for a shelter tag. Enough for a man who had written that number on mission forms, gear bags, medical requests, and the inside of his own memory. Caleb's hand slipped from Atlas's chest to the floor. The room blurred at the edges. Marin whispered something he did not catch. Willa sat back on her heels. "This dog had a prior working identification mark." Lena's voice was careful. "Military?" Caleb nodded once. He tried to speak and could not. For years, Atlas had existed in the cruel gray space of presumed lost. Not dead enough to bury, not alive enough to find. A ghost without a grave. Now the ghost lay breathing against his leg, shaved fur trembling, old number rising from scarred skin like a name carved into stone after the monument had been smashed. Atlas was not a look-alike, not a miracle Caleb had invented because grief was hungry. He was Atlas. Broken, renamed, misfiled, delivered in a van like unwanted cargo, but alive. Willa placed a hand lightly on Caleb's shoulder. She did not squeeze. She only gave him a human point of contact. "I'll document it," she said, carefully. Caleb nodded again. Atlas turned his head and licked the air near Caleb's wrist, too exhausted to reach all the way. That almost undid him. By afternoon, the dogs had been unloaded under Lena's order for emergency welfare inspection. The transport men protested until protest became a form of self-harm, then fell into angry silence. Each animal was assigned a temporary intake number, photographed, given water, and moved into quarantine kennels warmed with portable heaters. The old hound drank for nearly a full minute. The small mixed-breed dog crawled under a fleece blanket and disappeared except for a trembling nose. The gray collie refused to stand. Atlas, wrapped in a clean towel, should have been resting in the intake room. Instead, the moment he heard the collie whimper, he struggled up. "No," Caleb said softly. "You're done for today." Atlas took one step. His bad hind leg shook. Caleb could have stopped him easily. The dog was weak, too weak. But the look Atlas gave him was not defiance. It was duty stripped of pride. Marin opened the inner gate. "Let him see," she said quietly. Caleb looked at Willa. The veterinarian studied Atlas, then sighed. 2 minutes. No heroics. That goes for both of you. Caleb helped Atlas down the short hall. The collie lay in the corner of a lower kennel, gray coat dull, eyes milky with age or illness. When Atlas reached the gate, he lowered himself with a soft groan and placed his muzzle against the bars. The collie stopped shaking. No one spoke. Marin stood very still. All morning she had been brisk, sharp, and efficient. Now something old and frightened moved through her face. She crossed to the transport folder, flipped through it again, and stopped at a small printed code near the bottom of one page. Her red-gloved finger rested on it. FWD. Caleb saw the color leave her cheeks. "What?" he asked. Marin did not answer immediately. She looked toward the collie, then Atlas, then the folder. "I sent dogs to a place with those initials," she said. Her voice had lost all its thorns. "A rehabilitation outfit. Frostline working dogs. Last spring. Senior working dogs mostly. Hard cases. They said they specialized in them." Caleb waited. Marin swallowed. "They never sent proper updates." Lena stepped closer. "You reported that?" I asked. They answered with forms, photos that could have been any dog in any yard. Marin's hand closed slowly over the page. I wanted to believe they were busy. The sentence hung there, small and terrible. Wanting to believe was one of the gentler ways people opened doors to harm. Atlas remained lying beside the collie. Caleb felt something in the room change. Not a discovery, exactly. More like the first crack in lake ice, the sound that tells you there is dark water underneath. Later, when the immediate exams were done and the county hold was in place, Caleb stood in the shelter office with Atlas leaning against his leg. Lena had formally ordered the animals held for medical evaluation due to transport violations. Willa had begun reports. Marin had gone quiet in a way Caleb did not like. "You can take him home once Willa clears him," Marin said. "Temporary medical foster tonight, if paperwork allows. We'll sort the ownership claim." Caleb should have felt relief. He had imagined taking Atlas home so many times that the thought had worn grooves in him. The truck door open, the kitchen light on, the old bowl filled at last. Atlas sleeping by the stove, not as memory, but as weight and breath. He looked down. Atlas was not looking at him. He was looking through the office window toward the quarantine kennels, toward the collie, toward the others. Caleb placed his hand on the shepherd's neck, feeling the uneven fur, the old scars, the living pulse beneath all that had been done to him. He had lost Atlas once because the world had made a battlefield impossible to cross. This was not that battlefield. This was a snowy shelter in Maine. This was paperwork, law, medicine, witness statements, tired people choosing not to look away. Caleb bent close to Atlas. "I hear you," he said. Atlas did not wag his tail. He only leaned into Caleb for one brief second, then turned his head back toward the kennels. Outside, the winter sun began to fall behind the pines, turning the snow gold before it went blue. Inside, the dogs with the wrong names began their first night under names that might finally be corrected. Sheriff Nolan Price arrived at Harbor Fall Canine Haven just after dawn, carrying Winter on his shoulders and suspicion in his eyes. He was not a dramatic man. He did not come in with sirens, swinging doors, or speeches about justice. He parked his Brown County SUV beside the shelter office, took one slow look at the transport van under county hold, then at the quarantine building where the rescued dogs slept under heat lamps and fleece blankets. Only after that did he remove his gloves. Nolan was 57, broad in the middle and thick through the shoulders, with a square face reddened by years of cold patrols and a neat silver mustache that made him look sterner than he usually felt. His sheriff's coat was dusted with snow. A radio crackled at his shoulder. In one hand, he carried a paper bag from the bakery downtown. Marin met him at the door. "If that's breakfast, I'm listening," she said. "If it's evidence, I'm arresting the pastry chef," Nolan replied. He handed her the bag. "Blueberry scones. Don't tell Deputy Corbett. She thinks I'm trying to lower morale through butter." Marin took the bag but did not smile for long. Nolan noticed. He always noticed more than people expected. That was part of what made him good at his job and unbearable at town meetings. Caleb stood near the intake room, one hand resting lightly on Atlas's back. The German Shepherd lay on a padded mat near the heater, wrapped in a clean gray blanket, eyes half open. His ribs still showed beneath his coat, but the worst of the trembling had eased. Across the hall, the gray collie slept in a lower kennel, nose tucked under one paw. Whenever the collie shifted, Atlas's ears moved. Nolan saw that too. "Hell of a reunion," he said quietly. Caleb did not answer. Nolan looked from Caleb to Atlas, then to the file box Marin had placed on the office table. "Deputy Corbett briefed me. Transport violations are clear enough for the hold. But anything beyond that, we need more than bad paperwork and bad feelings." Marin set the bakery bag down without opening it. "Bad paperwork puts dogs in bad places," she said. "Sometimes," Nolan replied. "Sometimes it's just incompetence wearing a cheap coat. And sometimes cruelty wears a good one." Nolan gave her a long look. Caleb appreciated that the sheriff did not dismiss her. He only moved toward the table, sat down, and pulled the first file toward him. "All right," Nolan said. "Show me the coat." Marin had spent half the night printing emails, intake forms, transport receipts, and old messages from a private rehabilitation outfit called Frostline Working Dogs. The name appeared on 2 of the Northern Mercy documents as a routing code, FWD. It appeared again in Marin's records from the previous spring, when she had transferred 4 senior working dogs she could not safely place in ordinary homes. Frostline had looked legitimate then. That was the worst part. Their website showed clean kennels, snow-bright training fields, dogs running through pine woods with handlers in professional jackets. Their language had been polished until it shone. Specialized rehabilitation, behavioral reassessment, second careers for working breeds, a compassionate path for hard cases. Nolan read the printed pages slowly. Caleb watched him, impatient and silent. On the floor, Atlas stirred in his sleep. One paw twitched. A thin sound escaped him, not quite a whine, not quite a breath. Caleb lowered himself beside him and placed a hand near the dog's shoulder without waking him. Atlas's breathing steadied. Marin saw it. Her face tightened in a way Caleb had begun to recognize. Guilt had weight. It changed how people stood. These phrases, Nolan said, tapping one email. Behavioral reclassification. Placement redirection. Non-domestic suitability review. What do they mean? Marin rubbed both hands over her face. I thought they meant the dogs needed more specialized care before adoption. You asked? Yes. Her voice sharpened, then cracked at the edge. I asked. They answered with more words. Long, clean, expensive words, and I let the words stand where proof should have been. No one spoke for a moment. Outside, a plow growled past on the road, pushing snow aside in a heavy white wave. Caleb looked toward the quarantine hall. He thought of the dogs with wrong ages, wrong names, wrong histories. He thought of Atlas wearing a cheap tag that said, Bruno, as if a marker and plastic could erase years of blood, trust, and service. Nolan turned another page. Frostline isn't in our county. Vermont address. Private facility. Licensed. On paper, Marin said. Nolan glanced at her over his reading glasses. Paper is annoying like that. Caleb finally spoke. Paper lied about Atlas. Nolan looked at him, not unkindly. Paper may have been used to lie about Atlas. That distinction matters if we want this to hold. Caleb's jaw worked once. He wanted to hate the sheriff for being careful. It would have been satisfying, simple, even. But Nolan was right, and Caleb hated that more. Marin leaned over the file box and pulled out another folder. There's someone else asking questions, she said. As if summoned by the words, a knock came at the office door. A man stood outside holding a camera bag against his hip and a coffee cup that had clearly gone cold. He was tall, but narrow, with a charcoal wool coat, a dark hoodie underneath, and hair the color of old wheat going gray at the edges. A film camera hung from a strap across his chest. His face had the alert, hungry look of someone who noticed exits, quotes, and emotional damage in the same glance. Marin muttered, "Speak of the devil, and he brings a lens." She opened the door halfway. "Evan, Marin." The man lifted the cup. "I brought coffee as a peace offering. That coffee's from the gas station. It's a humble peace offering. No such thing." Evan Rourke looked past her and saw Caleb beside Atlas. Something changed in his face. Not enough to become decency yet, but enough to interrupt ambition. "You're Caleb Whitaker," he said. Caleb's eyes went to the camera. "No." Evan blinked. "No? No story. I haven't asked. You walked in carrying a camera and guilt-flavored coffee." Nolan made a small sound that might have been a laugh pretending to clear its throat. Evan held up one hand. "I heard about the K9, a reunion like that." "He is not a reunion," Caleb said. The room went still. Atlas opened his eyes. Caleb rose slowly, not stepping toward Evan, but somehow making the room smaller. "He's not a headline. He's not a miracle dog. He's not your Sunday feature with a soft focus photo and a quote about hope." Evan's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "I didn't mean—" "People usually don't." For a second, Evan looked ready to defend himself. The old reflex came up in his shoulders, in the tilt of his chin. Then a metal latch clinked somewhere down the hall as one of the shelter workers opened a kennel. Atlas flinched. It was small. A sharp pull inward, the body remembering before the mind could vote. Evan saw it. The photographer in him vanished from his face. In its place came something quieter and far less useful to a career. Shame. He lowered the camera against his chest. "I'm sorry," he said. Caleb did not answer. Marin studied Evan for a moment. "If you came for tears, leave. If you came to work, sit down." Evan looked at the files on the table. "What kind of work?" Marin opened one of the Frostline emails and turned it toward him. "The kind that doesn't put his face on the front page." Evan sat. That was how the investigation began. Not with a raid, not with a confession, not with a dog pointing his nose toward a hidden door, but with 4 tired people around a shelter table, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant, wet fur, and gas station coffee. Evan was better than Caleb wanted him to be. He knew how nonprofit registrations hid parent companies. He knew how glowing reviews could be copied, purchased, or posted by board members' cousins. He knew that deleted web pages were not always gone if someone had saved the bones of them somewhere. He worked fast, laptop open, fingers moving, film camera untouched beside him like a sleeping animal. Frostline was founded 6 years ago, Evan said. Graham Voss, former private trainer, worked with protection dogs, security dogs, some police contract work, but nothing long-term. Nolan leaned over. Criminal record? Nothing obvious. Civil complaints, maybe? I'll dig. Marin's eyes remained on the screen. I sent dogs there. No one softened the sentence for her. She did not deserve cruelty, but she also did not want comfort yet. Comfort too early could feel like a lie. Evan clicked through images. Their website says they specialize in high-drive animals unsuitable for standard domestic placement. That's broad enough to park a truck in. Nolan wrote something down. Financials? Not a nonprofit. Private LLC. They use rescue language, but they're not structured like a rescue. Marin closed her eyes. Caleb watched her hands. The red gloves lay on the table beside her, damp at the fingertips. Without them, her hands looked older than he expected. Chapped, scratched, strong. Hands that had carried dogs from ditches and scrubbed blood off kennel floors. I thought private meant better funded, she said. Better equipped. Evan's voice softened. That's what the website wants you to think. Marin opened her eyes. Don't be kind to me. I wasn't. You were. Nolan looked between them and sighed. Everybody stopped bleeding on the paperwork. We still need facts. That helped, strangely. By noon, facts began arriving in small, ugly pieces. A review from a rescue in New Hampshire had been deleted, but Evan found a cached version accusing Frostline of refusing updates after intake. A photo on Frostline's homepage showed a dog that had also appeared on a private security company's promotional page under a different name. Northern Mercy Transport had made repeated late-night routes between shelters, overflow facilities, and Frostline's Vermont address. Nothing proved the worst. Everything pointed toward it. Then the shelter phone rang. Marin answered, listened, and went very still. Yes, she said. Put him through. She covered the receiver and looked at Nolan. A man named Jonah Bell. Says he used to ride second seat for Northern Mercy. Nolan straightened. Caleb felt Atlas shift against his boot. Marin put the call on speaker. At first, there was only road noise, wind, and the breathing of a man trying to decide whether courage could kill him. My name's Jonah Bell, the voice said. Older, rough. Tired enough to sound frayed, Nolan spoke. Mr. Bell, this is Sheriff Nolan Price. You understand this call may become part of an investigation? A dry laugh came through the speaker. That's why I almost hung up. Why didn't you? Silence. Then, because I saw the shepherd. Caleb's hand tightened. Jonah continued. Picture got sent around. Not public. Driver chat. They're saying your shelter's making trouble over a dog named Bruno. Atlas lifted his head at the wrong name. Caleb bent and touched his shoulder. Jonah's voice lowered. He was never Bruno. No one moved. I don't know his real name, Jonah said. But I remember him. Big black and tan. Torn ear. Bad left leg. Wouldn't leave an old gray collie alone. Marin's eyes filled so suddenly she looked angry at the tears. Caleb stared at the phone as if he could drag Jonah through it by will alone. You worked those routes? Nolan asked. Some. To Frostline? A long pause. Yes. How often? Enough. Marin's voice came out thin. What happened to the dogs? I don't know all of it. Caleb stood. That's not good enough. Nolan raised one hand, but Caleb was already too full of old fire. Mr. Bell, Caleb said, each word controlled with effort. That dog was my partner. He was a military working dog. He was lost overseas and somehow ended up in your route under a false name. If you know something, you don't get to hide behind not all of it. The speaker crackled. Jonah breathed once, twice. You think I don't know that? His voice broke, not dramatically, but like old wood under weight. You think I don't see them when I try to sleep? The room quieted. Marin looked at Caleb, not scolding, pleading. Let him speak, Jonah went on. I told myself I was just driving. That the papers were legal. That if a place had a gate and a logo and people with clean jackets, it couldn't be that bad. Then I started noticing dogs didn't come back out. No adoption photos. No updates. Just more routes. More crates. More names changed. Nolan's pen moved steadily. Would you be willing to give a formal statement? I don't know, Mr. Bell. I got bills. I got a brother in assisted living. These people don't send angry emails when they're crossed. Caleb wanted to condemn him. Part of him did. A hard, clean part that had no patience for cowardice when animals had paid the cost. But Atlas had lowered his head again, exhausted by voices, still angled toward the hall where the collie rested. Marin spoke softly. Jonah, there are dogs still in the system. The speaker went silent. Not empty this time. Listening. If you stay quiet, Marin said, they stay there. Something in that sentence found him. When Jonah answered, his voice was smaller. I have route logs, not official, my own. Dates, stops, license plates. I kept them because I was scared someone would blame me one day. Nolan looked at Lena's notes on his phone, then at Marin. Where are you now? He asked. Parking lot behind St. Agnes thrift store. Bangor. Stay there. I'll have someone come to you. No uniforms. Nolan paused. We can work with that. And Sheriff? Yes. The shepherd was with Frostline longer than the others. I remember because Voss hated him. Caleb's face went cold. Voss? Nolan asked. Graham Voss. Runs the place. Talks like a priest. Handles dogs like equipment. The call ended 3 minutes later, after arrangements were made and Jonah agreed, barely, to meet an investigator. No one spoke for a while. Evan finally closed his laptop halfway. I can trace Voss's LLCs and linked contracts, quietly. Nolan pointed at him. You publish nothing without talking to me. Evan looked at Caleb, then at Atlas. I won't publish Atlas. Caleb believed him. Not completely. Enough for the day. As afternoon dimmed, the shelter settled into a strange, watchful rhythm. Willa came and went from the kennels. Lena returned to the office with updated hold documents. Nolan made calls from his SUV. Marin sat alone for a few minutes near the old gray collie's kennel, red gloves in her lap, saying nothing. Caleb stayed with Atlas. The shepherd had eaten a little boiled chicken from Caleb's palm, then turned his head away until Caleb sat on the floor beside him. Only then did he finish. Afterward, Atlas rose, stiff and slow, and crossed the hall to lie where he could see the collie. The collie stopped panting. Caleb watched them both and understood, with a grief that no longer belonged only to the past, that Atlas had not survived by forgetting. He had survived by refusing to abandon the frightened, even when frightened himself. Near sunset, Evan returned from his car with a printout in hand. His hair was damp with snow, and his face had lost its reporter's quickness. I found something, he said. Nolan took the paper. It was a corporate filing, then another beneath it, and another. Lines of ownership, contract references, names connected by thin black arrows Evan had drawn in pen. Frostline has financial ties to 3 private security firms, Evan said. Small ones, regional. One of them advertises reconditioned working breeds for property protection. Marin's face tightened. Reconditioned. Caleb looked toward Atlas. The dog slept with his muzzle near the collie's gate, one torn ear angled toward the room, still listening, even in rest. Nolan folded the printout carefully. This is enough to start asking harder questions, he said. Lena and I will begin preparing for a warrant request. We'll need Willa's medical reports, Jonah's statement, transport documentation, everything. Marin nodded. Evan nodded. Caleb did not. He was looking at Atlas. at the wrong name tag sealed in an evidence bag on Lena's clipboard, at the dog who had come back carrying not secrets, but witnesses. Outside, snow slid from the shelter roof in a soft thunder. Inside, the lie called Frostline began to lose its shape. Frostline working dogs looked beautiful on a screen. That was the first offense. On Evan Rourke's laptop, its homepage opened with a sweep of white Vermont hills beneath a bright winter sky. A black shepherd bounded across a training field. A handler in a clean navy jacket smiled beside a row of kennels so polished they might never have held fear. There were pine trees, fresh snow, shining bowls, and words arranged with the confidence of a church bulletin. Specialized rehabilitation for high-drive working breeds. Second chances through structure. Compassion with discipline. Caleb stood behind Evan's chair in the shelter office and felt something inside him close its hand. "Looks expensive," Sheriff Nolan Price said. "It is," Evan replied. His fingers moved across the keyboard. "Not rescue expensive. Private client expensive." Marin stood near the window, arms folded tight over her chest. She had not worn her red gloves inside that morning. They sat on the table beside the Frostline emails, damp from snow, looking smaller than usual. "Doctor?" Willa Sloan spread medical forms across the desk with quiet precision. Deputy Lena Corbett leaned against a file cabinet, reading from Jonah Bell's preliminary statement. Atlas lay on a thick blanket near Caleb's boots, weak but watchful. The old gray collie slept in the kennel room down the hall, and every so often Atlas lifted his torn ear toward the faint sounds from that direction. The room had become a war room, though no one called it that. Caleb would have hated the word. War had rules, at least in theory. This was something uglier. People using kindness as a painted sign over a locked door. Evan clicked to another page. A photograph of Graham Voss appeared. He was 56, tall and lean, with steel-gray hair combed neatly back from a long, severe face. He wore a dark waxed jacket and black gloves, one hand resting on the shoulder of a Belgian Malinois. His expression was calm, not warm, not cruel. Calm in the way of a man who believed he had already won every argument before speaking. Beneath the photograph was a quote, "The public often mistakes sentiment for mercy. At Frostline, we give difficult dogs what they truly need, order." Marin made a sound low in her throat. "There he is," Evan said. Graham Voss, former private trainer. Did short contracts with property security firms, some municipal consultation, a few protection dog seminars. No major criminal history. "Civil complaints?" Nolan asked. "3 that I've found, 2 dismissed, 1 settled, all vague." Improper handling. Failure to provide agreed updates. Unreturned animal after behavioral transfer. Lena looked up from the statement. "Unreturned animal? Owner sent a retired working dog for rehabilitation," Evan said. Frostline claimed the dog was unsuitable for return and had been redirected to a secure placement. Lawsuit settled before discovery. Nolan's mustache twitched. "Convenient." "Very." Caleb stared at Graham Voss's photograph. The man did not look like the kind of villain people warned each other about. There was no sneer, no dirty coat, no clenched fist raised in some obvious act of cruelty. That made him worse. The world was prepared to distrust monsters. It was far less prepared to distrust polished men with professional websites and words like structure. Atlas shifted. Caleb lowered a hand without looking. The dog pressed his muzzle briefly against Caleb's fingers, then lowered his head again. Willa cleared her throat. "I need everyone to hear this before it becomes another internet rabbit hole." The room quieted. Willa did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Her calm carried more weight than shouting because it had nothing to prove. "I finished the preliminary medical report on Atlas," she said. "Some injuries are consistent with neglect during transport or improper housing, cracked pads, dehydration, cold exposure, malnutrition, but several older patterns are more specific." Caleb felt his hand still. Willa placed 3 photographs on the table. They showed close sections of Atlas's body, the scarred neck, the damaged skin along his rib cage, the worn rawness beneath what had once been too tight restraint. She had taken the photos clinically. No drama, no pity. Somehow that made them harder to look at. "These marks around the neck are not from one bad collar," Willa said. "They suggest repeated restraint under pressure. This area here," she pointed with a pen, "could come from a slip lead or control loop being tightened over and over." Marin turned away slightly. Willa continued. "The stress response to metallic latches, raised male voices, and the sound of clippers suggests conditioning through fear. Not proof by itself, but combined with the injuries, it points toward coercive behavioral testing." "Meaning?" Nolan asked. "Meaning someone may have been deliberately provoking reactions to classify him as unstable, aggressive, or difficult to control." Lena's jaw tightened. "So the behavior becomes the excuse?" "Yes," Willa said. "And the excuse becomes the paperwork." No one spoke after that. Caleb remembered Atlas in another life. Young, powerful, dust on his coat, sunlight on his ears, waiting for Caleb's signal with absolute trust. He had been trained, yes. Disciplined, yes. But never broken. The difference mattered. A command given in trust was one thing. Obedience beaten out of a living creature was another. One was partnership. The other was theft. Evan's laptop chimed softly with an incoming email. He glanced at it, then sat straighter. Jonah sent more. Nolan moved behind him. Route logs? And a written statement draft. "He's still terrified, but he's writing." Evan opened the attachment. The words were uneven, full of misspellings and crossed-out phrases Jonah had not known would remain visible in the scan. Caleb found himself staring at the mistakes. They made the man more real. Not a witness in a courtroom. A tired trucker in a parking lot somewhere, hands probably shaking, trying to put shame into sentences. Evan read aloud. "I first saw the black and tan shepherd at Frostline in late November. They called him Bruno, but he did not respond to the name. He stayed near the gray collie in crate 6B. When staff separated them, he became distressed. Voss said the shepherd had contamination behavior and would make the others non-compliant." Marin whispered, "Contamination behavior?" Willa's face hardened. "Empathy, probably." Evan kept reading. "On December 3, a handler struck the gray collie with a control stick after she would not load. The shepherd moved between the handler and the collie. He did not bite at first, he blocked. Voss ordered staff to remove him. Later I heard Voss say, 'Move that one before he ruins the batch.'" The office went utterly still. Atlas lifted his head at Caleb's sudden silence, as if pain had made a sound only he could hear. Caleb did not move. Inside him, something old and dangerous rose with the patience of a tide under ice. He saw no detailed picture, and he did not need to. The words were enough. Atlas, thin and renamed, putting himself between a stick and an old dog that could not defend herself. Not because Caleb was there, not because someone had commanded him. Because Atlas had always known what Caleb had once known and later forgotten in the machinery of survival. The strong did not exist to be admired. They existed to stand in the gap. Caleb turned away from the table. Marin took one step as if to follow, then stopped. Willa said gently, "Let him breathe." Caleb went out into the kennel corridor. The shelter was warmer than outside, but the air still carried winter in small drafts around the doors. Dogs shifted on blankets. A bowl clinked. The gray collie lay awake now, milky eyes open, her narrow chest rising and falling. Atlas struggled to stand behind him, nails slipping once on the floor. "No," Caleb said, but the word came out tired. Atlas stood anyway. Slowly, painfully, the shepherd made his way down the corridor. Caleb followed, one hand hovering in case the dog's leg failed. Atlas stopped in front of the collie's kennel and lowered himself with a small grunt. He placed his muzzle near the gate. The collie's breathing softened. Caleb crouched beside them. He had spent years telling himself Atlas had died in an explosion. That grief had been savage, but clean in its own way. A battlefield could be cursed, blamed, buried under the category of war. But this was different. Atlas had lived. Atlas had crossed from one cruelty into another under paperwork printed on white sheets. He had been renamed by strangers. Handled by men who admired obedience but did not understand loyalty. Marked difficult because he would not let another dog be hurt alone. And Caleb had been here, in his warm house above the harbor, washing an empty bowl. The thought struck so hard he put one hand against the kennel frame. Atlas turned his head. The dog's eyes were tired, clouded by pain and medicine, but there was no accusation in them. That was the unbearable part. Caleb could have faced blame. Blame had edges. He could have gripped it, bled on it, argued with it in the dark. Forgiveness had no handle. It simply entered the room and made him kneel. Caleb bowed his head until his forehead nearly touched Atlas's. "I should have found you," he whispered. Atlas breathed against his cheek. Not absolution, not in words, but warmth, presence. The quiet mercy of a creature who had every reason to become hard and had chosen somehow to remain a guardian. Behind him, Marin's voice came from the corridor entrance. "I sent dogs to him." Caleb did not turn. Marin continued, and every word seemed dragged through snow. "I remember the day I signed the transfer. 4 of them. Senior working dogs. 2 shepherd mixes, a cattle dog, and a lab with bad hips who still carried tennis balls like it was a job. Frostline sent me photos later. Clean yard. Snow. Dogs standing beside a fence." She gave a humorless laugh. "I thought they looked stiff because they were old." Caleb finally looked back. Marin stood with her arms wrapped around herself. No gloves, no armor of sarcasm. Her face looked smaller in the fluorescent light. "I wanted to believe I had found a good place," she said. Wanting to believe is easier than driving 6 hours to check. Caleb understood then that grief had many rooms. He had been living in one for years. Marin had just opened the door to hers. He wanted to say it was not her fault. He could not. Not honestly. Not yet. So he said something better. "Then we check now." Marin nodded once. In the office, Nolan was already on the phone with Lena, who had gone to collect more formal documentation from the county system. Evan worked through Frostline's corporate filings and security company connections. Willa updated her report with measured phrases that would survive lawyers. The day became a long narrowing of possibility. Frostline had contracts with private security firms that did not publicly mention rescue. One brochure used the phrase reconditioned working breeds. Another listed dogs as low-cost alternatives to imported protection stock. Evan found one archived image of a kennel yard at Frostline where a dog with Atlas's torn ear stood in the background, half out of frame, identified in a caption as Bruno High Control Risk. Marin stared at that phrase until Caleb took the paper from her hand. High control risk, not loyal, not protective, not traumatized, risk. Language was a clean knife. Caleb was beginning to understand how many wounds had been made with it. By late afternoon, Jonah Bell agreed to give a recorded statement to an investigator arranged through Nolan's office. His voice, when played back on Nolan's phone, sounded older than 60. Voss didn't yell much, Jonah said in the recording. That was the thing. He'd talk soft. Made you feel stupid if you thought something was wrong. He said dogs like that needed firmness. Said rescue people ruined animals by loving them wrong. A pause. I believed him for a while. Or I said I did. Lena's voice asked. What changed? The shepherd, Jonah answered. Caleb shut his eyes. He wouldn't stop watching the others. Every time a dog cried, he'd look. Not scared exactly. Like he was counting who was still alive. Another pause. I started doing the same. The recording ended. No one spoke. Nolan removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. This doesn't get us through the gate by itself, he said. But it gets us close. With Willa's report, transport violations, Jonah's statement, and Evan's financial trail, I can push for a welfare inspection warrant. Maybe more if the judge agrees there's risk of evidence being moved. When? Caleb asked. Soon as I can do it right. Caleb's eyes sharpened. Nolan met them. Right matters. I know. Do you? The question could have offended him. Instead, it landed where it needed to. Caleb looked down the hall at Atlas. The dog was asleep by the collie's kennel, body curled awkwardly to spare his bad leg. He was not a weapon. Not anymore. Not ever again, if Caleb had breath enough to prevent it. I know, Caleb said, quieter. Evening fell early, blue and cold against the shelter windows. Caleb took Atlas home that night, only after Willa cleared him for temporary medical foster, and only after Marin documented every form with hands that shook once, and then steadied. The old collie remained at the shelter under Willa's care. Atlas hesitated at the door when Caleb tried to lead him out. Caleb crouched beside him. She's safe tonight, he said. Marin's here. Willa's here. Atlas looked down the hall. Caleb waited. At last, the shepherd stepped outside with him. The ride home was silent. Atlas lay across the back seat on blankets, too tired even to watch the windows. Caleb drove slowly through falling snow, past the dark harbor, past boats sleeping under tarps, past houses glowing gold against the blue night. When they reached the small cedar-sided house, Caleb opened the door and let Atlas enter first. The dog stopped in the kitchen. His nose lifted. Caleb froze. In the corner beside the cabinet sat the stainless steel water bowl, empty and clean, waiting beneath the dim kitchen light. For a long moment Atlas only stared. Then, stiffly, he crossed the room. He lowered his head to the bowl, sniffed the rim, and touched it once with his nose. Caleb felt the last wall inside him give way. He filled the bowl. Water rang softly against metal. Atlas drank slowly, not greedily, each swallow small and tired. When he finished, he did not move away. He stood over the bowl as if confirming it would remain. Caleb sat on the kitchen floor beside him, Bajabo to cabinet. Outside the window, snow fell through the porch light. Inside, the dog who had been renamed by strangers stood over the bowl that had never forgotten him. Caleb rested one hand on Atlas's neck. I'm going after him, he said. Atlas leaned, just barely, into the touch. Not for revenge, Caleb added, though the word tasted like iron. For every name they tried to erase. Atlas lowered himself beside the bowl with a weary sigh. His head settled on Caleb's boot. In the quiet house above the harbor, Caleb understood the shape of the promise before him. It was not the old kind, forged in fire and answered with force. It was harder than that. It would require patience, evidence, people. Truth strong enough to stand in daylight. And Caleb, who had spent years grieving a ghost, would have to become steady enough to protect the living. The storm arrived like a white army. By late afternoon, New England had disappeared behind curtains of snow. Roads narrowed into pale tunnels. Pine branches bent under the weight. The harbor vanished. Even the sound of the sea seemed muffled, as if the whole coast had drawn a blanket over its face and was waiting for something to pass. Caleb Whitaker was in his kitchen when Sheriff Nolan Price called. Atlas lay beside the old water bowl, chin on his paws, eyes half closed. The dog had eaten more that morning than he had the day before. Not enough to satisfy Dr. Willa Sloan, who measured hope in ounces and hydration, but enough for Caleb to mark it as a victory. The phone rang once. Caleb answered. Nolan did not waste words. We got movement at Frostline. Caleb stood so fast, Atlas lifted his head. What kind? Jonah's contact says they're loading dogs tonight. Could be a transfer. Could be clearing inventory before the warrant lands. Lena pushed the judge with Willa's report, Evan's filings, Jonah's statement, and the transport violations. We have enough for an emergency welfare inspection. Caleb was already reaching for his parka. I'm coming. No? The word was simple. Heavy. Caleb stopped. On the line, Nolan sighed. Caleb, listen to me before you decide I'm the enemy. I know where this is going. Good. Saves time. You are not law enforcement. You are emotionally tied to the primary animal involved. You are a former operator with every reason in the world to hate Graham Voss. That makes you useful later and dangerous now. Caleb's hand tightened around the coat. Nolan. No. If you show up acting like this is a mission, you could compromise the whole thing. Evidence, charges, chain of custody, everything. Through the kitchen window, snow swept across the porch light in hard white streaks. Caleb looked down at Atlas. The shepherd had risen. Slowly, painfully, but fully. He watched Caleb with that old, terrible attention, as if the room had filled with invisible commands. I can help with the dogs, Caleb said. After the site is secure, Nolan replied. Not before. The old Caleb, the one shaped by smoke and speed and impossible choices, would have hated that answer. He still did. Part of him wanted to be on the road already, hands steady on the wheel, every muscle ready to meet whatever waited behind Frostline's iron gate. But Atlas stood before him now, scarred and thin, not a weapon, not a soldier asking for orders, a survivor asking not to be left behind. Caleb closed his eyes once. Where do you want me? There was a brief silence. When Nolan spoke again, his voice had softened by half an inch. Staging area 3 miles from Frostline. Old County Salt Shed off Route 9. Willa will meet you there if she clears Atlas to travel. You stay there until I say otherwise. Caleb looked at the dog. Atlas took one step toward him and caught the sleeve of Caleb's parka gently between his teeth. Not a bite. A hold. A plea made of cloth. The sight struck Caleb harder than the sheriff's warning. Atlas was not trying to stop him. He was trying to make sure the door did not close between them again. I'll call Willa, Caleb said. Do that, Nolan replied. And Caleb? Yeah. Tonight is not about proving you would go back for him. Caleb said nothing. Nolan finished quietly. It's about making sure he never has to go back to being used. The line went dead. For a moment, Caleb stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand and Atlas holding the sleeve of his coat. Snow hammered the windows. The old water bowl gleamed under the cabinet light. Then Caleb crouched. I'm not leaving you, he told Atlas. But we're doing this right. Atlas released the sleeve. His torn ear twitched. That was the closest thing to agreement Caleb was going to get. Doctor, Willa Sloan arrived 20 minutes later in her old station wagon, headlights ghostly in the storm. She came in wearing a Navy veterinary coat, snow clinging to her silver hair, medical bag in hand, and irritation already loaded. I dislike everything about this, she said. Noted. I dislike your tone, too. Also noted. She examined Atlas on the kitchen floor, moving with the slow, careful patience that had earned the dog's wary trust. She checked his gums, his pulse, the tenderness in his bad hind leg, the raw places beneath healing skin. Atlas endured it, though his eyes remained fixed on Caleb the whole time. He is not fit for stress, Willa said. Caleb nodded. He is not fit for work. I know. He is not fit to be symbolic either, if anyone gets romantic ideas. I know. Willa looked at him over her glasses. Do you? The question had teeth. Caleb accepted the bite. I do. Atlas lifted his head and touched his nose to Caleb's wrist. Willa sighed. He may travel to the staging area. Soft lead only. No tactical vest. No commands beyond comfort and safety. If he shows distress, you leave with him. If Nolan says stay back, you stay back. If I say stop, you stop. If Atlas says no, you listen. Caleb nodded once. Agreed. Willa's expression eased, but only slightly. Good. I have no desire to fight a Navy SEAL and a German Shepherd in a snowstorm. It sounds like a bad use of my evening. Wouldn't recommend it, I assumed. The drive to Vermont was slow and strange. Willa followed in her wagon, its yellow hazard lights blinking through the snow behind Caleb's truck. Atlas lay across blankets in the back seat, not resting, not truly awake. Every time Caleb glanced in the rearview mirror, The shepherd's eyes were open, reflecting dashboard light like two dim embers. At the old salt shed off Route 9, the storm had turned the world into a white blur. County vehicles sat in a rough line, engines running, red and blue lights muted beneath falling snow. Deputy Lena Corbett stood beside Nolan's SUV, clipboard tucked inside her coat, body camera blinking, dark hair hidden under a black cap crusted with ice. Nolan came to Caleb's window before Caleb opened the door. "Stay here until I call," he said. Caleb looked past him toward the road that led deeper into the hills. "How many dogs?" "Unknown." "How many people?" "Voss and at least 2 staff. Maybe transport crew. We'll know soon." Caleb's jaw tightened. Nolan leaned closer. "Say it." Caleb frowned. "Say what?" "That you understand." The storm hissed around them. Caleb wanted to resent him. Instead, he looked back at Atlas, who had managed to sit up despite the pain, watching both men like a judge with fur. "I understand," Caleb said. Nolan nodded. "Good. Because if this works, it works because everyone stays in their lane." Lena approached with Willa, both women bent against the wind. "Inspection team is ready," Lena said. "Animal control's behind us. 2 transport vans for medical evacuation. Willa, you'll enter after safety clearance." Willa pointed at Caleb. "And he enters after me," Nolan grunted. "That was the plan." "It is now written in the air," Willa said. "Very binding." Even Nolan almost smiled. Then the vehicles moved. Caleb remained behind. That was the hardest part. He sat in the idling truck while the convoy's lights vanished down the snowy road toward Frostline. Atlas made a low sound in the back seat, not quite a whine. Caleb reached behind him and let the dog press his muzzle into his palm. "I know," Caleb said. "Believe me, I know." Waiting, he discovered, required a different kind of courage than going in first. It had no rhythm, no target, no useful violence. It was simply the discipline of not breaking what needed to hold. Minutes passed, then more. The radio Nolan had given him crackled from the cup holder. Gate in sight. Static. Frostline sign visible. Static. Sheriff Price making contact. Caleb stared through the windshield. He imagined the iron gate, the polished sign, the clean language. Graham Voss standing there in a waxed coat, calm as a priest at a funeral he had arranged. The radio hissed again. "Voss on site. Claims transfer was scheduled. Denies welfare concerns." Another voice. "Lena's crisp beneath the storm. Multiple crates visible in loading bay. Requesting entry under warrant." Static swallowed the next few seconds. Atlas stood in the back seat, unsteady. "Easy," Caleb murmured. The shepherd did not sit. Then Nolan's voice came through. Lower now. Entry granted under protest. Caleb released a breath he did not know he had been holding. At Frostline, the world looked exactly as its website promised, and nothing like mercy. Later, Caleb would remember the first sight of it from the staging road. A long iron fence crowned with snow, a dark wooden sign lit by amber lamps, Frostline working dogs carved in elegant letters. Beyond it stood a series of low buildings arranged with almost military neatness. Kennel runs, a training yard, a barn-like structure with fresh paint on the front and rusted hinges at the back. Under the lights, the snow looked clean enough to baptize a lie. Nolan's team had already secured the main yard by the time Willa was called forward. Caleb drove behind her, staying where Lena directed him. He could see officers moving with controlled purpose, not rushing, not shouting. Animal control staff in winter gear, unloaded carriers, and medical kits. The storm made halos around every headlamp. Graham Voss stood near the office entrance. He was taller than Caleb expected, lean, straight-backed, silver hair combed neatly despite the weather. He wore a dark coat, black gloves, and the expression of a man enduring foolishness from lesser minds. His eyes passed over Caleb once and did not stay. That was wise. "You people are making a mistake," Voss said to Nolan, voice calm enough to chill the air further. "These animals are high risk. Sentimental handlers misread structure as cruelty. Marin, who had arrived with the animal control team despite Nolan's warning to stay outside the first sweep, stiffened beside Willa. Nolan answered without heat. "Then the records will show that." "They will, if your people understand what they're reading." Lena stepped from the loading bay holding a stack of folders sealed in a plastic evidence bag. "We're learning quickly," she said. Voss's jaw tightened by a fraction. Caleb saw it. Not fear. Annoyance. That disturbed him more. Inside the loading bay, the first signs were not theatrical. No hidden dungeon, no dramatic room of horrors. Just crates stacked too close. Bowls without enough water. Labels with names crossed out and rewritten. A cabinet of sedatives logged under vague behavioral codes, leashes stiff with old use. Clipboards, transfer sheets, language everywhere. Managed, redirected, unsuitable, reconditioned. Dogs looked out through wire with eyes that had learned not to ask loudly. Willa moved among them, her face pale but steady. "Start triage here," she told the animal control techs. "Smallest and coldest first. Document before moving unless medically urgent." Marin stood near a row of crates, one hand over her mouth. Caleb waited at the threshold with Atlas on a soft lead. The dog trembled, but he did not collapse. His nose worked slowly. His eyes moved from crate to crate, not searching like a trained K9, but remembering like a survivor walking past old graves. Willa turned back to him. "Slow." Caleb nodded. They entered only after Lena confirmed the immediate area was safe. No one asked Atlas to lead. No one gave him a command. He chose his own pace. At the first crate, a young shepherd mix shrank back, then stopped when Atlas lowered his head and breathed through the wire. At the second, an old hound lifted his nose. At the third, a black dog with white paws stared without blinking until Atlas lay down for a moment, making himself smaller. The room changed, not in any way a report could capture. The dogs did not become suddenly well. Fear did not evaporate because one scarred shepherd walked among them. But a thread moved through the room, a fragile, living thread, the kind that says, "Something has entered that does not intend to hurt you." At the far end of the row, a thin sound rose from a lower crate. Atlas froze. Caleb felt the lead go still. Willa whispered, "Let him." The shepherd moved forward, each step careful. Caleb saw the bad hind leg shake, saw the old scars ripple beneath the coat, saw the dog gather himself, not with strength, but with memory. The crate at the end held the gray collie, not the one from Harbor Fall. Another gray collie, older or perhaps only worn older by fear, with cloudy eyes and a narrow face. For one crushing second, Caleb thought Atlas had mistaken her for the dog at the shelter. Then he understood. Maybe the collie in Harbor Fall had not been the only one. Maybe Atlas's grief had a breed, a color, a shape, repeated in cages down the years. Atlas lowered himself before the crate. The collie's whimper stopped. She stretched her nose toward the wire. Atlas pressed his muzzle to the gap. Caleb crouched behind him and put one hand on the dog's back. He had no words, none that would not make the moment smaller. Across the room, Graham Voss watched. For the first time that night, his calm cracked. "Remove that dog from the area," he said. Nolan turned. "Why?" "He's disruptive." The word hung in the air like a confession wearing a suit. Caleb stood slowly. Nolan's eyes cut toward him in warning. Caleb stayed where he was. He did not step toward Voss, did not raise his voice, did not give the man the satisfaction of turning pain into spectacle. "He's comforting her," Caleb said. Voss looked at him then. "Fully. You're the handler." "I was his partner." Voss gave a faint smile. "That kind of language is usually where the trouble begins." Caleb felt the old fire rise. Then Atlas exhaled behind him, a tired, soft sound. Caleb looked back at the dog lying before the collie's crate, too weak to stand tall, too loyal to move away. The fire changed shape. It became something colder, stronger. "No," Caleb said. Trouble begins when men like you mistake obedience for worth. Voss's smile vanished. Lena came out of the office building holding another evidence bag, this one filled with tags, dozens of them. Plastic, metal, taped labels, some with names, some with numbers, some scratched until unreadable. "Marin," she said quietly. Marin stepped forward. Lena showed her one tag through the clear plastic, a faded name. One of the 4 dogs Marin had sent months ago. Marin's face folded inward, not loudly, not dramatically. She simply sat down on a crate as if her knees had forgotten their agreement with the rest of her. Willa went to her side. Caleb looked at the bag of names and felt the room tilt. Here it was. Not hidden under the floor, not buried in a field. Names removed and stored like spare parts. Proof of erasure sitting in a plastic bag beneath fluorescent light. Nolan's voice changed after that. "Graham Voss," he said, "you're being detained pending investigation for animal cruelty, fraud, and obstruction related to welfare inspection records." Voss straightened. "This is absurd." "Probably," Nolan said. "Courts enjoy absurd things when they come with evidence." The arrest was not cinematic. No struggle, no chase, no shouted confession. Just a polished man in black gloves being turned around beneath clean signage while dogs watched from crates whose doors were beginning, one by one, to open. That was enough. By midnight, Frostline no longer looked beautiful. It looked smaller. Animal control loaded the weakest dogs into heated vehicles. Willa moved from crate to crate, making notes, giving instructions, touching frightened bodies with the care of someone handling cracked glass. Lena photographed documents, labels, storage cabinets, transport lists. Nolan stood in the snow speaking into his radio, his mustache white with frost. Marin helped carry a small dog wrapped in a blanket. She was crying now, silently, and still working. Perhaps that was the only honest way to cry in such a place. Caleb remained near Atlas. The shepherd lay outside the gray collie's crate until the animal control team was ready to move her. When they lifted the crate gently, Atlas tried to rise. His leg failed halfway. Caleb caught him. "Enough," he whispered. Atlas leaned against him, shaking. This time, Caleb did not ask him to keep standing. He gathered the dog carefully into his arms. Atlas was too large to carry easily, but too tired to object. His weight settled against Caleb's chest, all bone and breath and stubborn life. Outside, snow fell through the floodlights. Caleb carried him past the iron gate, past the sign, past the clean words carved into dark wood. Behind them, Frostline's buildings glowed under police lights. No longer a sanctuary, not yet ruins, but something stripped of its mask. At the edge of the loading area, Caleb stopped and looked back. Voss sat in the rear of a county vehicle, face turned away. The dogs were being counted. Named, documented, touched gently. For the first time that night, Caleb felt the storm not as burial, but as covering. A white cloth laid over wounds so the work of healing could begin beneath it. Atlas's head rested under his chin. Caleb held him closer. "You did not come back alone," he said. Atlas gave no answer. He did not need to. Around them, doors opened, engines warmed, and one by one, the forgotten were carried into the snowlight under their own names, or under names they would soon be given. Spring did not come to Harborfall all at once. It arrived in small negotiations. First, the ice loosened around the harbor pilings. Then the gulls grew louder, as if they had personally defeated winter and wished the town to know it. Snow slid from roofs in heavy sheets. Mud appeared along the road shoulders. The pines stayed dark and solemn, but beneath them, the earth began remembering green. By then, Frostline Working Dogs was closed. The sign had come down in March. Evan Rourke had taken a photograph of the empty iron gate, but he did not publish it on the front page. He used it inside the third article, small and plain, beneath a headline that did not mention Caleb or Atlas at all. When rescue becomes a marketplace, the hidden system behind unregulated dog transfers, Caleb respected him for that. The investigation had moved slowly, as real things often did. Graham Voss and 2 staff members were charged with animal cruelty, falsifying transfer records, and obstruction related to welfare inspections. Northern Mercy Transport lost its license after state agencies reviewed its routes, medical paperwork, and repeated failures to meet transport standards. Other shelters began checking old transfers. Some found dogs. Some found only gaps where dogs should have been. Jonah Bell gave a formal statement. He was not celebrated. No one called him brave in the easy way people sometimes did when they wanted guilt to dissolve before it had finished doing its work. Jonah had waited too long. He knew that. Caleb knew it too. But his records helped investigators trace more routes, more false names, more animals that had almost vanished into paperwork. On the morning Jonah came to Harbor Fall Canine Haven to sign additional documents, he stood outside the quarantine building, holding his cap in both hands. Caleb found him there. Jonah looked older in daylight than he had sounded on the phone. Thin shoulders, gray stubble, eyes that had learned to glance away before they were struck by the full weight of anything. "I don't expect forgiveness," Jonah said. Caleb studied him. Behind the kennel door, dogs barked, then settled. Somewhere inside, Marin was telling a beagle that stealing a roll of paper towels was not technically a personality. "Good," Caleb said. Jonah flinched. Then Caleb added, "Start with use." Jonah stared at him. "There's a fence post that needs replacing out back," Caleb said. "If you came to feel better, wrong door. If you came to help, gloves are in the shed." For a moment, Jonah looked as if someone had handed him a punishment and a gift in the same box. Then he nodded. He worked for 3 hours in the mud. Caleb did not thank him. Jonah did not ask him to. That was the shape of some beginnings. Not clean, not pretty, but honest enough to stand on. Evan's articles changed the town in a way anger alone could not have. He did not print Atlas at his weakest. No close-up of ribs. No trembling muzzle behind wire. No sentimental caption asking people to cry and move on. Instead, he wrote about systems, about beautiful websites and unchecked transfers, about how good people outsourced responsibility to professional language, about how names were changed, histories blurred, and dogs with years of service were reduced to phrases like high control risk or non-domestic placement candidate. People read the articles over breakfast, at the diner, in waiting rooms, in pickup trucks outside the bait shop. Some were angry, some were ashamed. A few insisted they had always known something was wrong, which made Marin snort so hard coffee came out of her nose. But they donated, not out of curiosity. Not because they wanted to stand near a famous dog. They donated because the story made a mirror and held it steady. Money came in small checks and folded bills. A retired carpenter offered lumber. A hardware store sent hinges and heat lamps. The bakery put out a jar labeled, "For the old dogs who still deserve breakfast." Someone left 6 fleece blankets on Caleb's porch without a note. Caleb disliked the attention. He accepted the blankets. Atlas accepted them faster. By late April, the idea that had once sounded too large to say aloud became a place with mud, permits, arguments, and splinters. The land belonged to Caleb. 3 acres at the edge of the pine woods, inherited from his father and ignored for years because grief had made Caleb suspicious of open spaces. There had been an old equipment shed, a leaning fence, and a field that filled with snowdrifts every winter. As a boy, Caleb had watched fireflies there. As a man, he had driven past it without looking. Marin looked once and saw kennels. Willa looked once and saw a treatment room. Sheriff Nolan looked once and saw 12 county forms Caleb had failed to file. Deputy Lena Corbett looked once and saw exactly where the fencing needed double latches, weatherproof locks, and a posted emergency route. Evan looked once and said, "This place needs a name." "No," Caleb said. Marin nodded. "Definitely needs a name." "No." Willa, who was examining Atlas's left hind leg near the truck tailgate, did not look up. "If you let Marin choose, it'll be something emotionally devastating." Marin pointed at her. "That is slander, and also accurate." Atlas sat beside Caleb, healthier now but still thin through the hips. His black and gold coat had begun to grow back in uneven patches. The torn ear remained. The crescent scar on his shoulder had faded but not vanished. Some things did not need to disappear to stop hurting. That evening, after the others left, Caleb stayed on the land until the sky turned blue-black. He had strung temporary work lights along the first run of fence, yellow bulbs clipped to posts, glowing low through the trees. Atlas stood beside him in the soft mud. The lights reflected in the dog's eyes, not bright, steady. The name came then, not as a grand inspiration, but as something already waiting. The lantern field. Marin cried when he told her, then denied it, then named 3 kennel sections before breakfast. The lantern field opened small because Willa had threatened to sedate Caleb if he tried to save every dog in New England before the foundation cured. 6 dogs came first. The gray collie from Harbor Fall, whose cloudy eyes saw little, but whose nose found chicken with holy accuracy. Marin named her June, because she had survived long enough to deserve a warm month. An old hound with a voice like a broken trombone. A retired detection dog with stiff hips and deep suspicion of ceiling fans. 2 shepherd mixes who slept back to back. A black dog with white paws who refused to enter any building until Atlas went in first, then pretended the decision had been his own all along. The place was not beautiful in the polished way. Frostline had been beautiful. The lantern field had crooked early fences, boot prints by every door, and a treatment room that still smelled faintly of sawdust. There were warm wooden kennels, thick bedding, heated water bowls, and records kept in plain language. Every dog had a file with a real name, known history, medical notes, fear triggers, favorite food, and the kind of touch they tolerated. Marin insisted on update calls for every transfer, every foster, every adoption. "Too many calls," Caleb said once. Marin looked at him over her coffee. "Wonderful. We'll be famous for being annoying." Lena helped design the intake forms so no dog could vanish behind vague phrases. Nolan came by to review permits and somehow always left biscuit crumbs in his patrol vehicle. Willa held monthly clinics at a discount, so Steep Caleb accused her of practicing charity in disguise. "Don't insult me," Willa said. "I disguise nothing. I am openly unreasonable." Evan still came by sometimes, but he had learned to leave his camera in the car unless invited. One afternoon, Caleb found him sitting outside the fence, not taking pictures, just watching Atlas lead the black dog with white paws down the snowy path. "You writing?" Caleb asked. "Not today." "Then why are you here?" Evan smiled faintly. "Trying to remember that not everything has to become a story." Caleb nodded. It was the best thing the man had said yet. Atlas did not become what people wanted him to become. That mattered most. Visitors occasionally asked if he still worked commands, if he could demonstrate some military skill, if Caleb would ever put his vest back on him for photos. Caleb always answered the same way. "He's retired." Sometimes that ended the conversation. Sometimes it did not. On those days, Marin stepped in with the smile she reserved for people about to regret being alive in her office. Atlas wore no tactical vest, no hard collar, no heroic costume for human comfort. Only a soft brown leather collar with a brass tag Caleb had ordered from a craftsman 2 towns over. Atlas Home. His new work, if anyone insisted on calling it that, was gentler and far more mysterious. On the first night a new dog arrived, Atlas would choose whether to lie outside the kennel. No one commanded him. No one staged it. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he stayed away, as if knowing his presence was not what that animal needed. When he did lie down, he placed his body where the frightened dog could see him and then slept lightly, waking at every cry. "He became," Marin said, "the worst employee we have." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "He refuses schedules, ignores paperwork, and naps on duty." Atlas yawned. "Also," Marin added, "he has perfect instincts, so we can't fire him." The old collie June adored him. She followed the sound of his steps more than any human voice. On clear mornings, Atlas led her slowly along the fence line, matching his pace to hers. Two damaged creatures moving through a field as if the world had finally stopped demanding speed. Caleb changed too, though he noticed it last. He still worked at the boat shed, still drank black coffee too late in the day, still wore the olive combat shirt when he needed courage from old cloth. But his house no longer sounded empty. Atlas slept near the kitchen most nights, close to the water bowl. Sometimes he dreamed and twitched. Sometimes he woke suddenly and searched the room until Caleb spoke his name. "I'm here," Caleb would say. That became enough. Not always, but often. One morning in early winter, almost a year after the van had stopped at the shelter gate, snow returned to Harborfall with a softness that felt familiar rather than cruel. The lantern field lay white and quiet beneath the rising sun. Yellow lights still glowed along the fence, fading as daylight strengthened. The pine trees stood like old guardians at the edge of the property. Breath rose from the dogs in little silver clouds. Caleb stood by the wooden rail with a mug of coffee in one hand. Marin was in the office arguing with a printer. Willa's station wagon was expected by noon. Nolan had already dropped off permits and biscuits. Lena had texted a reminder about latch inspections with 3 exclamation marks, which Caleb considered excessive but wise. In the field, Atlas lay among the older dogs. His coat had filled out. Not completely. The scars remained visible in certain light, pale roads across black and gold. His bad hind leg still stiffened in cold weather. His torn ear still gave him the look of a knight who had argued with a dragon and filed a complaint afterward. But his eyes had changed. That was where the miracle lived. Not in his survival, though survival was no small thing, not even in his return. The miracle was that Atlas no longer looked at every open door as a trap. He no longer slept as if sleep were a risk. He no longer drank from his bowl as if water might be taken back. Caleb set his mug on the fence post. "Atlas." The shepherd lifted his head. For a second, snowlight caught the amber in his eyes. Then Atlas rose slowly and came across the field. June lifted her head as if considering whether to follow, decided breakfast mattered more, and put her muzzle back on her paws. Atlas reached Caleb and stopped. Caleb did not bend immediately. He waited. The dog stepped closer and pressed his forehead gently against Caleb's left knee. The old gesture, but not the old meaning. There was no panic in it now, no desperate bracing against a world that might tear them apart. It was simply contact, recognition, a wordless report from one survivor to another. Still here. Caleb lowered his hand to Atlas's neck. For years he had believed some returns were impossible, that a life could split and the missing half would remain forever on the other side of fire. Maybe that was true sometimes. The world was not kind enough to return everything it took. But here, in a field ringed with lanterns, one lost name had come home and brought others with it. Caleb looked across the snow at the warm kennels, the opened gates, the paw prints crossing and recrossing the field like messy handwriting. He thought of the empty bowl that was no longer empty. He thought of Marin's red gloves hanging by the office door, of Willa's calm hands, of Lena's clipboard, of Nolan's biscuits, of Evan learning when not to lift a camera, of Jonah fixing fence posts, in silence, because some apologies needed splinters. He thought of Graham Voss only briefly. Less than he expected. That was another kind of freedom. Caleb crouched beside Atlas and rested his forehead against the dog's. Some warriors came home in uniform. Some came home in memory. And some crossed several winters on wounded paws, carrying not glory, but the stubborn belief that no one should be left behind in a cage with the wrong name. The wind moved softly through the pines. The lantern field glowed beneath the morning, not grand, not perfect, but alive. And for the first time in many years, Caleb did not feel that he was guarding a ghost. He was keeping a promise. Sometimes healing does not arrive as a loud miracle. Sometimes it comes quietly, on wounded paws, asking us to look again at what we thought was lost. Caleb could not change the years Atlas suffered, but he could choose what those years meant from that moment forward. He chose mercy over anger, truth over silence, and love over usefulness. May this story remind us to notice the forgotten, protect the voiceless, and never underestimate the small light we can become for someone else. If Atlas and Caleb's journey touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories of loyalty, healing, and hope still matter, consider subscribing to walk with us into the next one. May peace find you gently, and may grace meet you where your heart still hurts.